I'm Mark Schwartz. I'm founder of PDT. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary a couple days ago, so it's kind of exciting. We're a product development firm located in Chicago, and we have some other offices around the world. And we're about 100, or a little better than 100, engineers and designers doing research, engineering, etc. We work in a number of industries, including about 50% of our businesses in medical devices. I was fortunate enough to start my career in the 80s at Motorola, so I had a front row seat of the maturation of the cell phone over the years. I also got to see the rise and fall of Motorola, Nokia, RIM, and now we've got Apple and Android leading the world. And I genuinely believe that the reason that Apple and Android generally are so successful is because they're the ones, they were the pioneers in opening up the architecture of the phone. Prior to that, you think back about Nokia, RIM, and Motorola, they were always very guarded about the architecture of the phone and giving you access to some of the data that the phone was producing. Apple changed that paradigm, and lo and behold, you had apps everywhere, which is really a cool thing. What I'm going to do in my portion is I'm going to touch on the 4 different levels as we see them for leveraging a smartphone for medical applications. We're also going to show some other examples that are non-medical. So these are in order of difficulty, by the way. The first one is the simple smartphone app. So we show an example here of a Weight Watchers app. Pretty simple to develop. User interface is extremely important, ease of use, but this allows you to write an app and access some of the sensors like geo-positioning or accelerometers within your phone for free, and then create algorithms to somewhat approximate exercise, for example, and calorie burn. Is it going to be super accurate? Probably not. It's not going to work if you're not wearing your phone, etc. But then these apps also rely heavily on user input. So some of the pros is they're really simple. The user interfaces are simple. They're on a device you're familiar with. They're relatively inexpensive and short lead times to develop them, and typically they're free for the most part. But they are very limited as far as the accuracy of the data. And like I said, they often rely on the honesty of the person putting inputs in, and if you're counting calories, putting in the right foods, and etc. So I wouldn't say they're so much medical grade, but they're also very handy and frankly quite motivational. Generally speaking, when you keep statistics, you're motivated, right? Because most people are competitive and they want to outdo themselves. So it is very helpful from that perspective. 2 major players dominate the space. The Android devices and the iPhone devices makes up anywhere from 85 to 95% of the space. I personally had a Windows phone for a while, and I absolutely loved it, but I did give up on it because there's rarely any apps written for it, because everyone's doing Android and Apple only for the most part. One little tip to mention here is that in our experience, we found it's better to develop one of the platforms first in its entirety, and then do the second platform to follow, because it goes much smoother. It's much more efficient. In other words, if you try to do them in parallel, you're going to be debugging things twice and stuff. So generally speaking, a tip would be to do them at the same, one after the other. The second, slightly more complicated, is linking a wireless device to a smartphone. The example here is the Nike Fuel Band. So this is cool stuff. It's a wearable device. It's wirelessly attached to the phone. It can leverage the phone for things like setup, but then complements the phone by adding a whole new set of sensors that are strategically located on the body to perform various tasks to feed data back wirelessly to the phone. Typically these are Bluetooth, and something to note about that is by virtue of being wireless, one, it disadvantages your supporting 2 batteries, 2 devices. That could be kind of a hassle. And there are some limitations in bandwidth with things like Bluetooth. Here's another example of a device that does a very specific thing. This actually sniffs your skin to see if you've been drinking any alcohol. So Lindsay Lohan actually made this famous. In fact, she used to paint it with nail polish to kind of disguise it, because it actually has a secure band on it, so it's tamper-proof. So if you're lucky enough to get assigned one of these, you're stuck with it. What it does is it has a proprietary sensor in it. It actually runs a pump that constantly sniffs your skin, and it can actually sense if you drink one single beer. If it does sense that, it will send a report through your cell phone to the parole officer, who then, dings you that you're in violation. Again, these systems, they raise the level of compliance to a whole nother level. Think about asking Lindsay Lohan to be on her honor about things, as opposed to a device that actually tracks it and you really have no control over. It does mean that in this case it has to be rugged. You have to be able to take a shower with it. It also, the proprietary sensor, since it's pump-based, is a battery hog, so you do have to bring it in every month and have it taken off, cleaned, and a new sensor and batteries are put in it. So there are some, several cons with this sorts of technologies too. There's also some development challenges. I'm going to say time and time again that architecture is key with any of these devices. Architecture meaning which wireless protocol do you pick, how much bandwidth do you need, how much battery space do you have, how small does it need to be, etc. All that stuff is critical when you're defining the requirements and specifications of devices like this. I've included a handy chart that we won't go through here, but it does talk about the pros and cons of the various wireless protocols that you're given by default with your smartphone, and it also suggests what some of the best applications are. So Bluetooth, ANT, NFC, and Wi-Fi. So please download the presentation and use that. The third is actually where you hardwire or direct connect the piece of hardware to the smartphone. We at PDT affectionately call those accessories. It means it combines an app with a physical accessory. This is not a medical device, it's a military device that we did, but it's fully ruggedized, and it uses an iPhone as the user interface and the screen and partially the brains. The cool thing about doing a direct connect is that it allows you to share battery power. So as long as this device is charged, it can keep the phone charged. You don't have to worry about 2 devices and one wearing out before the other and shutting you down. The other cool thing about this is behind this door, the iPhone becomes rugged for field use. But if you'd like to deploy it in a non-rugged situation, the soldier can deploy the iPhone and control this device remotely if he'd like, which is pretty cool. Ultimately, though, the best part about it all is it's an interface people are comfortable with. It's approachable. They understand it. And you can use it offline as well as a standalone phone and look at your data anytime you wish. Now, we could see this really expanding into healthcare relative to cost savings and things, but there are some downsides, of course, as well, particularly the fact that cell phones do change a lot. The hardware changes a lot. When you look at the myriad of different sizes and shapes of phones, you have to be very careful when you're using the shape of the phone to dock. There are clever ways around this. You also have to be careful of the life of the phone versus the life of the device so that you always know that you can support your device. There's another issue, too, to be careful of. One of the reasons Apple does so well is they make you license through the MFI program or Made for iPhone program. They actually embed a chip in the Lightning connector shown here, which allows Apple to control the fact that you've paid a fee. You basically overpaid for this chip in order to access the Lightning connector. We've actually seen lately iPhone 5 accessories that use the Lightning connector are not working on a lot of iPhone 6 phones now because Apple actually clamped down on that protocol. And so the result of that is I can tell you that this device that PDT developed for a juice pack for your phone, the workaround we have is a little adapter, micro USB to Apple adapter. When the iPhone 6 came out, that little part went from $1 to $3.60 because now they're policing it closer and making sure people are using MFI approved connectors. Here's another chart that talks about the pros and cons again of the various ways that you can hard connect to the phones and what those are, where the best applications are. There's also an interesting workaround here using the headphone jack. There's a company called Square who has done very well, and their workaround was to plug into the audio jack, and they were able to because the data, the small packets of data that they needed to send for the credit cards were able to be passed through the audio jack. And there is a little bit of power that you can draw from the audio jack, although it's very small. So that's an interesting option for precisely the right applications. Certainly not for all. And then the last is the most exciting, I think, is the medical device full-on ecosystem, where the phone is kind of the central hub, and you create an ecosystem of products. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. So here's a great example of a very intelligent, advanced glucose meter that has the ability to check your glucose with a disposable strip, as well as track your diet and some other things that it's sensing. It has a Bluetooth connection to a smartphone, but it also has a Bluetooth connection to an ambulatory infusion pump. So the cool thing about this ecosystem, and again, this becomes complicated. It becomes a Class 2 medical device. It's making decisions about dosing. It's tracking compliance to what you've been told to do for tests. So while this is complicated, it also takes everything to the next level from like I said, a compliance standpoint. And when you're tracking compliance so closely, it's really a win-win-win. It's a win for the provider of the device and the disposable because they get to sell what they're supposed to be selling. It's a win for the patient because they're going to feel better because they're doing what was prescribed and not blowing it off. It's being tracked. They're also going to feel a lot better because by using a device of this level of sophistication, it's constantly monitoring your readings and your health and your diet. So it's giving you shots of drug when you need it and in smaller doses so you don't have the ups and downs of crashes and things. And the device is discreet and wearable, so you're just going to have a better quality of life, frankly. That also makes the health care provider or the insurance company much happier, too, because it allows them to control costs much better. Now you're more responsible for your own care, and it's being tracked that you're doing it properly. It's also great for a family member, too. So let's say that your older parent gets prescribed this device. Since it's using the smartphone to get to the cloud and run through a server, not only the practitioners and the physicians and everything have access to data, I can also have access to my 85-year-old mom and make sure that she's okay and that she's testing and things like that and that her numbers are in the right zones and stuff. So this is really the future, I think. I think that it creates that win-win-win I was talking about. I think it will help drive down the costs of care. It'll give people better quality of life. I think it's really an important step. But I can't stress enough that the full-on ecosystem type level does require, a fair amount of engineering and software. It requires good research to understand the needs of all the stakeholders, and it also is much more regulated, obviously, in this case, like Class 2. So, like I said, there can be a considerable lead time involved in these types of products, a fair amount of software, a lot of firmware. It also requires you to think about architecture much more thoroughly. So, for example, does it make sense to put the cellular chip in this device, or do you leave it in the cell phone? Most people like to keep the cell phone chip out of the device because it requires another SIM card, which requires another bill, which requires a lot of battery drain and bigger batteries and a bigger device. So we see it being popular to keep the cellular in the phone. But you also have to think about redundancies with servers. You also have to think about redundancies with the wireless protocols. If you say, for example, grandma is in extended care facility with big, thick brick walls and cellular doesn't work well, you may need to have another system where it picks up on Wi-Fi, et cetera. So there are a lot of things to think about in these. Continuing on that thought, I had mentioned generally high costs for development, long development cycle, et cetera. And again, this large diagramming and research and use case scenarios really has to be studied correctly to come out with the right product and put the right technology in the right pieces of the ecosystem. So there's a lot to consider. We think that a lot of it comes from good research and good development of requirements and specifications in order to do the best product, and to do that up front and really think this through before you embark on the larger scale type device. I'll open it up for questions now if anybody has any questions. Thanks for your time.
You mentioned research. Would you expound on what you mean by research? What kinds of research are we talking about?
We think that as the breadth of stakeholders widens in this new healthcare arena, meaning that in the old days all we cared about was what the doctor thought and did he like the product. Nowadays it's much wider. There's the person who makes the buying decision, the person who actually purchases it, the person that maintains it, cleans it, sets it up, the person that uses it, the family member that wants to monitor it. So we believe that it's really important when you're developing requirements for your new device that you do upfront stakeholder research. So, and that would also include voice of the customers and voice of the stakeholders and also voice of the business. So making sure you understand all those people's needs and you turn them into quality requirements so that you get the best product, and that when it does finally get to market, you've done your homework and it is what everyone wants because you've considered everyone's inputs.
Is 510K clearance mandatory for home health care, personal care products?
Well, generally speaking, the way we usually look at this is there is an FDA site that's really quite friendly. You have the ability to go onto that site and search around for similar or predicate devices, and what that'll tell you is if you're a Class 1, 2, or a 3. So, for example, even a Band-Aid is a Class 1 medical device. I don't believe apps are regulated now because they don't really drive any decisions per se, but certainly some of the stuff I was showing as it got further down the complexity chain definitely are. And those depend then whether there's a predicate device and you do a standard 510K, or if it's required that you do clinical trials and et cetera. So the whole regulatory thing is an important part of your early stage development, and rendering an opinion and getting that verified relative to what your regulatory requirements are.
We have a comment. You'll have to forgive me if I mispronounce this. Yehonatan, I probably messed that up. But he or she, pardon me, offers that well-being devices do not require FDA approval. However, if it presents HR or any other medical info, heart rate that is, FDA approval is required. So thank you for that. With so many devices all needing to work together, there seems to be a lack of collaboration between companies, resulting in the lack of cohesion inside the hospitals. Hospitals get frustrated as a result. How can we do better to develop solutions to this growing issue?
It is true that you know, a very popular term these days is the Internet of Things, and as we see so many devices getting Internet enabled, it actually does have the benefit of commonizing a platform in a sense that devices that may have their own idiosyncrasies and user interfaces and stuff, if they're getting to the Internet, they could be then going to the nurse's iPad that she's carrying around. So in a way, that does consolidate a lot of data, and a person can monitor several devices in a common platform that's friendly. So there is some good things going on in that area too to get it a little better consolidated. And we see that across a lot of industries, not just healthcare.
Which organizations do you work with to test the efficacy of your products? Do you work with hospitals, universities?
As much as we sometimes curse the FDA, I suppose, when they're in our shorts, I suppose, you have to appreciate that the process works, and the fact that you go through various, you establish a V&V plan, you go through a feasibility stage, which isn't under design control, you create proof of concepts, you test them, you switch over to the next stage where you get into formal design, and you're under design control, and you have to do verification and validation against initial requirements, and you're keeping a design history file, you're tracking hazards and risks. I think the process that the FDA has for us and forces us to use is a healthy one, and I think it works really well. It's different from a case-on-case basis, but I really think it works very well.
Do you have any thoughts on product development based on platforms for use in consumer devices, such as self-administration, self-injection devices? Have you thought about how platforms can be developed and used in this context?
Yeah, so I think for drug delivery systems, right, they're an excellent candidate for this notion of an ecosystem. So if you're infusing some sort of a drug through an electromechanical process or whatever, that's the perfect kind of device where you probably want to keep it small, you're focused on pain, ease of use, compliance. So it's very similar to what I had shown, where you keep that device as small as possible with smaller batteries, with a simple wireless protocol that then uses your cell phone strategically for user setup and monitoring, and that being a hub to the cloud or whatever. So I think that's exactly where you want to lay out an intelligent architecture, as opposed to, for example, saying, wow, I'm going to put Wi-Fi in this device, and then it's only going to upload stuff when it happens to be on a valid Wi-Fi wireless connection, or you know what, I'm going to assume that the user always has their smartphone next to them when they're using this. So yes, I'm just going to simply use Bluetooth, and I'm going to use the phone for these things, and move that technology to this appropriate place and not do it over again. So as I stressed architecture throughout my whole thing, I think that's exactly what I was talking about.
For medical-grade devices, what do you think about the necessary infrastructure, configuring and delivering the devices, monitoring their integrity, reacting to generated alarms, etc.? In my opinion, setting the organizational structure is a major hurdle. My question is, who is configuring the device? A nurse, a computer guy, the patient? Who?
You know, if you take the analogy of you find out you're diabetic and you're being given a glucose meter for the first time, there is a nurse that trains you for the first time, helps you set up the device, teaches you how to use it, and then when you go away and you start using it and get confused and things, then there's hotlines and stuff that you call. I think with these types of devices, it'll be a lot easier for when the device is connected and when the device is going to the cloud, instead of it just being a dumb autonomous device like I just explained. Once it's connected, that nurse that trained is going to be able to see that they're doing it correctly remotely. You're going to be able to have more, be able to push more tutorials and things like that when people forgot because they were nervous. They just found out they have this diabetes and they threw this meter at them and they weren't paying close enough attention because they're upset and things like that. So I believe that what we all see with our smartphones now, I mean, back in my travels, there was huge user manuals for cell phones, and you actually had to use them. And nowadays, nobody looks up anything anymore. You can kind of figure it out. So I think the user interfaces have gotten so good, the screens have gotten so good. As long as you can make the user interface that common thing that you're using every day anyway, I think the chances of success and ease of use and user satisfaction are just that much higher.
The development cycle for the devices can be 24 months or longer. How do you manage the evolution of the interface, the smartphone, while you are developing the device and trying to validate your application?
I think from beware when you do the hard connect to the phone, the accessory that we talked about. That's really tricky. But I think on the software side, I think maintaining upgrades of software from, say, an Apple 5 to an Apple 6, et cetera, or Samsung, that's relatively clean and relatively easy. We don't see the devices these days are quite stable, and we don't see functionality going away. We just see additional functionality. So normally you're going to get good upwards compatibility, while you still need to do some upgrades and account for new screen sizes and resolutions and things. Generally speaking, that's relatively smooth to support, I think. So having said that, I mean, you have to move your development along with what the latest and greatest thing you have is, and a lot of these have evaluation kits or things that you can leverage. And Android's been pretty, even though it's free, license-free, there's not a whole lot of support necessarily, but they've been very consistent with the releases, and there's a lot of support blogs out there and stuff if you do get into issues when a new rev comes out. You can get good support.
Are there currently any fully integrated single diagnostic platforms that are consumer-focused, eliminating the need for individual separate disease conditions?
The place to roam around is the AACC conference for that question, which is coming up here in June in Atlanta, I believe. But that's where stuff like that is launched. But what we are seeing is much more point-of-care testing being done, so you don't have to send it out to a lab necessarily. A lot of the stuff may not make it into the home necessarily, but it is at least in the doctor's office now, so you do get quick feedback on tests, which I think is the next step. I don't think it's gone all the way yet, though.
From what I've understood, the specialization gained from a unique standalone device provides the greatest data from sensors for diseases or the conditions tracked. How does a user deal with the overload of having multiple devices?
Yeah, that's definitely an issue. And in the case of the glucose meter that I showed, the one unit that the user really didn't have to worry about was the pump. So there can be, when they're designed really well, the user can only be exposed to just need-to-know basis stuff and not have to be some expert in all these different complicated devices. It all boils down to the user interface and great design, honestly. When you're managing care like that and you happen to get some sort of a condition, I think most people feel blessed that they've been given an opportunity to manage it themselves and not have to go to the doctor all the time. So I think there's sort of like a, I'm okay with it because I'm controlling it and I can manage it myself and I have freedom. So while it does stink to have a pile of pieces of electronics perhaps, I think the benefits far outweigh the downside of it. Yeah. We just saw too the latest Samsung phone has a heart monitor in it now. So they'll keep adding functionality to the cell phones, and now these watches are going to come out and they're going to start, since they're body worn now, they're going to enhance and take on more measurement for us. So boy, you think about all the stuff you used to have to carry around. Think about your CD player with goofy batteries and stuff, carrying that stuff around. It's all gone. So,
can you suggest some online focus groups to get feedback on a product we're trying to develop as a startup?
Well, I'd say one of the ultimate online opinion getters is either Kickstarter or Indiegogo. If you do a Kickstarter campaign and you get funded, people like it, that's for sure. We mentioned research earlier. These days, more people do qualitative research, not quantitative. So there's a lot less focus groups and stuff going on these days, as there's a lot more of the qualitative kind where you're talking to stakeholders and stuff. We've seen a lot of medical device-oriented things get launched on there, and some of them go wild. There was the Generation 2 watch that just came out, raised $9 million in the first day.
Well, let's leave it there. I will thank our presenters, Mark Schwartz from PDT. Great presentation. I've already got a few emails telling me so I know it's true. And I will have the video, slides, and transcript available online shortly. Thank you all for joining us.